Kakadosh Boker Tov, we're continuing and we're going to start the new chapter, Perek Shvi'i, the 7th chapter of Masechet Pesachim, Ayin Daled Amud Aleph 74a1. Okay, so this is actually what's brought down. Okay, so Kakadosh, so we're continuing again. We're starting the Mishnah, the 7th Perek, Ayin Daled Amud Aleph. It says, Keitzad Solin et Pesach. How do you roast the Korban Pesach? Mevi'in Shapud Sher Limon. So you're going to bring a skewer of an etz rimon, of a pomegranate tree. Yeah, so you're going to bring a branch of a pomegranate tree, v'tochvo letoch piv, and you're going to stick it into the mouth of the animal, right, of the sheep, ad lebet nekuvato, until the back part of the animal, right, the anus, as they say in doctor's terms, okay? V'notenet kira'av vet bnei me'av letocho, and they're going to put the kraim, which are the legs and the intestines, inside of it. Okay? So it says over here, the arba kraim ubnei ma'im muchnasim toch halal haguf. They put it inside of the animal in order to roast it. These are the words of Rabbi Yosef HaGalile. Rabbi Akiva Omer, Rabbi Akiva says, yeah, he comes and he says, Kemin bishul huze. What is that considered? That's bishul. Right, that he's cooking the bnei me'ayim inside like a kedera, which means if you're going to take the legs and the intestines and you're pushing it on the inside of the animal and then you're roasting it, it's like cooking. It's like cooking inside of a pot. Ela tolin chutzala, but rather you hang the legs and the bnei me'ayim, the intestines, on the outside of the animal, not on the inside of the animal. En solin et pesach lo la shipud velo la askela. So it says here, you're not allowed to roast the korban pesach not on a metal skewer, and not on a reshet mimatechet, on the metal grills. Thank you. Right, on the metal grill. Amar Rabbi Tzadok, says Rabbi Tzadok, Maaseh ben Gamliel she'amar leTevi Avdo. There was a story with Rabbi Gamliel that he told Tevi, his servant, Tzeh utzle lanu et haPesach al askela. Go and roast it on top of the grill. So obviously here the Gemara is going to ask, is this a Maaseh listor or not listor? Which means, is this story a story which is going to contradict that we just mentioned in the Mishnah, or it's not? Because at the end of the day, it sounds like it's going against it. Because we just said that you're not allowed to do it on the metal grill, and 1 second later it says, Rabbi Tzadok, that Rabbi Gamliel told his servant Tevi to do it on the grill. Fine. So says the Gemara, V'neiti shel matechet, why don't we bring it on matechet, on metal? So says the Gemara, Aidi decham mikzato cham kulo kamitve mechamat hashipud. There's a very interesting concept, which is basically cham miksato cham kulo. This is brought down actually in Basar v'Chalav as well. Cham miksato cham kulo means that sometimes you have something that if it's a little bit hot here, it becomes hot also there. Which means, especially with metal, which metal is a very good heat conductor, many times you could happen that the metal in itself, right, will make everything hot, even though it's not directly on the fire. So he says, if you're going to bring something which is made out of metal, since we say cham mitzato cham kulo, which means if a little bit which is revealed, or which is going to be on the fire, is going to be hot, so then that's going to make everything else hot as well. So then it's going to be roasted because of the heat of the skewer and not the heat of the fire. And the Torah says tzeli esh, it has to be heated up by the heat of the fire and not because of something else. You understand what we just said? Which means it's like a conductor. It's very important. This is actually brought down. By the way, you should know, they actually asked this question because they wanted to say, if you were going to say cham mitzato cham kulo, imagine right now, I took my glasses. This is actually a question in Dira Days. I don't know if you ever heard of Dira Days. There's a book that they came out with, which is called Dira Days. Boys, they go to the Dira in Eretz Yisrael, which means they go and they stay in dormitories. But the dormitory is not a regular dormitory, right? They go into houses. So therefore, the boys come. Let's say they're going to be in yeshiva. So they're still not married. So they go 3-4 boys and they rent out a house, an apartment, and each one has their own room. Now they're all staying in their own, and they're dividing the rent amongst everyone. Okay, that's just the way that they do it. So it's called Dira Days. Why Dira Days? Because boys have all the most incredible ways of cooking and of doing different things. So for example, right, you don't have an oven there, right? They don't have a full kitchen. So now how are you going to make pizza, right? So what do? Right? They have, let's say, the dough of the pizza. They'll put cheese on top. They'll put baking paper. They'll take the iron, and then they'll iron on top, so that way the cheese melts inside of the pizza. Yeah, or they do that on top of bread or on top of things like that. If you want to boil eggs, they don't have a stove. What do? They took the kumkum, the urn, right? They put the egg inside, they put the water, and then all of a sudden they put it to heat up. And all of a sudden the water starts boiling up, and then boom, they have hard-boiled eggs. Yeah, and all these different things. So they say, what happens right now, if I didn't have a spoon, so what do? I make myself my coffee. And the Yisachar has his coffee over there, and I come and I take my glasses, and I'm going to stir the coffee with my glasses, with the handle of my glasses, yeah, right here, the arm of the glasses. So I stir the coffee, meet them, right? It's going to be a coffee with milk, a good coffee, yeah, cafe latte, cappuccino, whatever you want. And then what happens? Comes the afternoon, and now I want to have, right, a soup mix. And again, I don't have a spoon. So what do? You know those soup things that, you just add hot water and that's it. So now I want to stir it. So what do I want to do? Let's say it was actually meaty. They're usually part of it, but let's just pretend it was meaty. Can I use the other side of the glasses, right, in order to stir it? Because maybe I have basar v'chalav. Because if I say cham miksato cham kulo, that if this is a little bit hot, then the entire thing is hot. So therefore, this is hot, which automatically will make this hot. So therefore, this entire thing becomes milky. So now my glasses are milky glasses. However, though, if you're going to tell me that no, so then only this side is milky and this side is going to be meaty. What's the problem? You understand? So these are all the questions in Dira days. They made an entire book just on all these types of questions. You don't understand what type of questions. You understand? Does the iron become now milky? All these, like you remember, like all these incredible questions that they only think about. These are boys that are in dormitory yeshivas. Yeah, yeshiva dormitories. This is what they think about. Fine. So says the Gemara, since we say chamitzato cham kulo, which means if you would do it with metal, the metal part, which is not on the fire, would also become hot because of the fire, but it's not the fire. So then it's going to roast the Korban Pesach because of the skewer, the metal, not because of the fire. And the Torah says, "Tzli esh v'lo tzli mechamat davar acher." So ask the Gemara, "V'neiti shel dekel." So bring from a palm tree. Why? Okay, I understand. You can't bring metal, but bring a palm tree. Why does it have to be a tree of a pomegranate? So says the Gemara, "I didit leshibe." Since the palm tree has charitzim, it has like little cracks. So mapik maya. Water comes out of it when you heat it up. And then it comes out that it's like considered mevushal. But remember, bishul is always with water. If you don't have water, it's considered sli, roasting. So here also it's going to be a problem because then it's going to be considered that you're cooking the Korban Pesach and you have to roast it. You're not allowed to cook it. So that's why you cannot have any cracks and crevices. What? What has liquid? Secretes liquid. Exactly. The palm tree has liquid. So the palm tree has liquids and it has little cracks. So when you heat it up, the liquid comes out. So then it's considered that you're cooking with the liquid. You're cooking and you're not roasting. You have to roast the korban. You're not allowed to cook it. Okay. The neiti shel tena. So says the Gemara, why don't I just bring from a tena tree, from a fig tree, right? So says the Gemara, aidi de mechalchel. Yeah, aidi de mechalchel, which means since the anafa tena is chalul, since it's hollow, okay. So he says since it's going to be hollow, mapik maya, again water is going to come out. And it's going to be considered mevushal. It's going to be considered how do you call it? It's going to be considered also cooked instead of roasted. So it says the Gemara, "V'naiti shel alon shel charuv shel shikma." Why don't you bring from a carob tree or a sycamore tree or an alon? How do you translate alon in English? Alon tree.
Oak of carob or
sycamore. Oh, oak. So oak, carob, or sycamore. So I did eat bekitra since it has ksharim. It's called like different types of knots. So mapik maya, the water will come out as well. So says the Gemara, right? The reason why you cannot use the oak, the carob, or sycamore is because since it has knots in the branches, so then mapik maya, it's going to take out the water, and then it becomes again a problem of bishul. Shalimon nami it bekitra. So the Gemara says, 1 second, if it's a pomegranate, also it's going to have knots. So answers the Gemara, shie kitre, which means the knots of the pomegranate are chalak, they're very smooth, and therefore you don't even have to cut it. It's very smooth, so you don't even have to cut it. V'baitem, if you want, you can answer v'navga barshata. We're talking about a nitiyah bachnata. It's the first year of the pomegranate. Teled bekitre, that it still doesn't have any knots in the tree. Okay, so says the Gemara v'ha'ika bepiske, which means that there's a part in the branch, right, from the etz b'ksea shipud, and therefore from there, meaning at the bottom part of the skewer, there could come out water. So answers the Gemara, demapik lebe piske lebar. You take out that part to the outside of the animal. So therefore, even if water is going to come out, it's going to fall downwards and it's not going to go into, meaning the skewer in itself, there's going to be one place where there's going to be a hole, so there water could come out. He says, yes. you put it downward, so that way the water will fall down into the water, right? The water will fall down, right? It's going to come and the water will fall down downward, so therefore there's not going to be any problem. Okay, fine. So says the Gemara, Matnitim de lo Rabbi Yehuda. So our Mishnah is not like Rabbi Yehuda. The Tanya was we learned in the right that Rabbi Yehuda says, Keshem sheshiput shel etz eno nisraf, just like a shiput shel etz, a shiput of a wood is not going to be burnt, right? Kach shiput shel matechet, so too eno martiach. So too a shiput shel matechet does not martiach, which means like this: when you put a shiput shel etz, a skewer of wood, it does not get burnt, right? So it says over here, so to the shiput of matechet, which is a skewer of metal, right? Eno martiach. It's not going to come and it's not going to roast because of it. So Amrulo, they said, zecham mitzato cham kulo, zecham mitzato and cham kulo. He says, no, the reason why is because when it's matechet, we say cham mitzato cham kulo, but when it's the etz, we do not say cham mitzato, right, cham kulo. Okay, which means only by metal, right? Only by metal do we say that if a little bit of it is hot, so the entire thing becomes hot, but not by anything else. And by the way, you should know that's actually it's very interesting. You could actually see that many times. You could take a metal utensil, and whether it's a ladle, why do they make that? Many times the ladle, the top part will be made out of like a different whether it's going to be plastic or something else. Because if it's going to be metal on the bottom and the entire thing is metal, so then the entire thing will become very hot. So what do? You purposely make it that they're different pieces, right? So therefore, it's not going to become the entire thing hot because again, by metal, that's the nature of metal. Okay. Next, v'noteret kira'av. So you're going to place the legs and the intestines inside of it. These words are Rabbi Yosef Galilei, right? So we're by the two dots. So Tanya, we learned in the Braita, Rabbi Ishmael korehu tuch tuch. Rabbi Ishmael used to call the korban pesach, which is roasted inside of the oven, tuch tuch. Why? Because when you have the limbs which are inside, it starts making a sound. So the sound that it's making is like tuk, 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 it's like a bubbling sound. Yeah. So therefore he says he used to call it tuch tuch. Okay. So he says over here, Rabbi Tarfon koreu gedi mekulas. Rabbi Tarfon used to call it a gedi mekulas. Gedi is the kid, which is mekulas, which is going to be. It says here, Shema Evarim Anetunim, Me'arosha Be'ema, on top of the animal, right? And it looks like a kova nechosha, it looks like a metal, an iron, how do you call it? Not iron, copper, a copper hat, which means that's why it's called Gedi Mekulas. So it looks like it's like a hat on top of the Gedi, on top of the kid, on top of this animal. Okay? Tanu Rabbanan, we learned in the Braita. What is a gedi mekulas, which is asur to eat on the night of Pesach nowadays? If you roasted the entire thing in one shot. If it was cut off one of the membranes, one of the limbs, or it was cooked, it's not considered a gedi mekulas. It means the second that you took part of it and you cooked it and you didn't roast it and it wasn't roasted in one shot, it's not considered gedi mekulas, which is prohibited to eat nowadays. So hashta yishloman. Now we're going to say shenechtach bimenu ever deafgav dekamatvi lebeade. But even though it's being roasted together, amartlo, you said no. So nishlach mibaya. So then you need to say if it's going to be cooked part of it. Obviously not. The second that you're cooking is not roasting. So Amar Rav Sheshat says Rav Sheshat sheshelako b'mechubar. Even if you cooked it when it was still attached to the body, meaning as long as you cooked part of it, even if it was attached to the body, it's not considered gedi mekulas anymore, and therefore there's no problem whatsoever. Okay? Amar Rabba says, Hai mulyata, right? This tle or off, which is filled with basar katush, right? Which is filled with meat. And they roast it. Sharia, it's going to be mutar ba'achila. You're allowed to eat it. Okay? So says the Gemara, Amar Abaye says, V'akabal adama. He says, 1 second, but you're bolei adam. It's absorbing the blood. So Amalei, so he comes and he says, Kebolo kachpulta. He says kibola kafulta, which means just like it's bolea, so too it's going to be polet, which means just like it absorbs, so too it lets out. This is, by the way, the general terminology that we use for koshering products. Kebolo kachpulto, the way that it absorbs, so too that's the way that it spits it out. Which means that, for example, bishul. Why is it that by bishul, right, anything which was cooked, for example, a pot, you do hagala? Because just like it absorbed, because it had the liquids which is absorbing the taste inside, right? It's absorbing the taste inside of the food, inside of the pot. So too, when you do hagala, that same method is taking it out of it. Kebolo kach polto. But let's say there's no liquid. So if there's no liquid, so then it's like roasting it. So you need a fire, the same thing, to take it out. You cannot use a liquid to take it out anymore. Because kebolo kach polto, the way that it absorbs, so too that's the way that it's going to let it out as well. Right? The way that it comes in, it comes out. Okay, so neima mesayale notenet k'rave b'nei me'av letocho. Maitama. So therefore there's a proof. Because what did we just say? We just said you're going to put the legs and the intestines inside of it. What's the reasoning? La mishum damnina is not because we say kebolo kach polto. Amri, they said shane atam, it's different over there. Kivan diika. So he says, Kevan diika beta shchita de mechalchel. He says you have the beta shchita, which is mechalchel, which means our Mishnah is a little bit different because the beta shchita is, which is the place where you do the shechita, the slaughtering of the animal, is chalul. And therefore what happens is that it's facing downwards during the time of the tzliyah. Okay, so therefore, since it's going to be downwards during the time of the tzliyah, right? Okay, fine. Okay, fine. So therefore, all the blood is going to go downwards. Okay, fine. Perfect. So says the Gemara, we're on Ayin Daled Amud Bet, right? 74b. Made of Daive. Says 1 second, but the blood is going all the way down outside. So says the Gemara, Leima Mesayele. So why don't we just say that it's going to help it in the fact when it says over here as follows. It says maybe Leima Mesayele, maybe it's going to come and it's going to help. Halev koreo motzio demo. The heart. How do you kosher the heart of an animal? So you have to tear it open and you have to take out the blood. Lo kerao, if you didn't tear it open, right? Koreo leachar bishulo. So then you have to tear it after you cooked it, right? And then it's going to be mutar. Maitama. What's the reasoning why the heart is going to be permitted to eat? During the time of bishul, it's going to be absorbed, right? It's going to be absorbed with the basar alev. So therefore, lamishum damnin, aren't we going to say it's because kebolo kach polto, which means kebolo kach polto, which means that the way that you're going to absorb it is the same way that it's going to let it out. So answers the Gemara, shane lev the shia. The heart in itself is halak. It's very smooth, and therefore it does not absorb any of the blood inside of it. So since it's not going to absorb any of the blood inside of it, so therefore we don't have a problem. That means even though the blood is coming outside, and then we said it's going to be a problem. If it's going to be absorbed, it's going to be considered bishul and not going to be considered roasting. And we said you have to roast it and not cook it. He says, no, the lev is shia, the lev is smooth. Since the lev is smooth, it's not going to roast, it's not going to absorb any of the blood. Anyway, remember, it's downwards, which means that the beta shchita, which is the place where you're slaughtering it, is going to be on the bottom. So all the blood is going to go downwards. But even the rest of the blood, which is going to trickle down, it won't be absorbed. So you don't have a problem with it. Okay, so now it says the Gemara. Ravin Sava, right? Ravina Zaken, he went and he took a gozal. So right, it's a you said in English, a pigeon. A dove, right? A young dove. So he comes and he takes a young dove. And what happens is that he put batzek, he put, right, different types of dough, right, on top of it, right, for Rav. And then he went and he roasted it. The Amalei, so he went and he told him, Imale tifle havli ve'echul. If it has a good taste, right, in the batzek, in this dough, which is going to be baked, so give it to me and I'm going to eat it. So which means, so now 1 second, how could it be? If you put batzek, right, if you put this dough surrounding, right, this gozal, so obviously the blood is going to be absorbed inside of the dough, right? Because remember, you only have to do melicha if you're not going to roast. Any type of an animal that you're going to take, right? Whether it's going to be a chicken, whether it's going to be an animal, right? What do you have to do? You have to get rid of the blood, right? Now remember, if you're going to eat it live, right? Live doesn't mean the animal's alive. That's ever been a chai, obviously. If you're going to eat it raw, right? So then you can roast it. Why? Because what happens is the roasting takes it out. Okay, that means the roasting takes out the blood and there's no problem. However, though, there's another way of doing it. You could eat it raw even without roasting it. All you have to do is wash out on the outside, right? And then that's it. Why? Because the dam be'en, the dam which is on the outside, is prohibited. However, when you rinse it out, the dam ha'evarim, the dam which is balua, which is absorbed inside of the animal, is not prohibited unless it moves from one place to another. This is in Siman Samech Vav in Yisur Ve'eter, Hilchot Dam, which means that if I took an animal, and this is actually brought down in Dalacha, by the way, in Siman Yichin Yudchet, Maram brings down that if a person has to come and slaughter an animal for a person that is sick, so he's allowed to slaughter an animal for a person that's sick. So the question is, are you allowed now to come and to eat the animal if it's going to be raw, meaning a healthy person? Is he allowed to come? A healthy person eating raw meat? Can he eat it the way that it is on Shabbat? Yeah, we're talking about on Shabbat. Yeah, basar chai. So here,
On Shabbat. No,
for the sick person. Yeah.
Rabbi did the shechita.
Yeah, they did the shechita on Shabbat for a sick person.
Yeah.
For a sick person. So it says over here. Yeah, let me see where it brings it down here. It says. Here it is. Maran says, "Hashochet b'Shabbat lecholeh." If somebody's going to do shechita on Shabbat for a person that's sick, ben shechala me'etmol ben shechala yon. Doesn't matter whether he became sick yesterday or today. Mutar bari le'echol mimenu chai b'Shabbat. You're allowed to eat it raw on Shabbat. So here it says chai b'Shabbat ubelo melicha, without melicha. You're not allowed to do melicha on Shabbat. Melicha, if you remember, to salt something on Shabbat, there's a machloket between Rashi and the Rambam. What's the reason why it would be asur? Is it because it's mevashel? Because we know maliach keroteach, which means when you salt something, you make it like cooking it, right? That's pickling it. So pickling it is asur. Or it's because it's domel me'abed. You're like when they used to come and preserve meats, they used to come and they used to actually salt it in order to preserve it for a long time. So because of that, you're not allowed to. So melicha, you're not allowed to do on Shabbat. What does he say? Hadacha baya mishum dam be'en. You need to do hadacha. Hadacha is rinsing of the meat on the outside because of the dam be'en, because of the dam which is on the outside. Mashen ken dam balua bo, but the blood which is absorbed inside of the meat, leka isur. There's no isur. Kol zman shelo piresh. As long as it didn't shin yudchet sif bet. But this is in Orach Chaim. If you look in Yoreh De'ah, it's siman samech vav isur vete. Okay, so that's what's brought down.
What doesn't move?
Because it doesn't move. What does it mean it doesn't move? So for example, if you cook meat without melicha, you prohibit it. Because when you cook the meat without doing melicha, the blood moves within the meat. And therefore, once the blood moved within the meat becomes prohibited.
But even on the roasting, you
still,
the halakha says you put a little bit.
Yes, you put a little bit of salt. Yes, you put a little bit of salt. 100%. 100%.
So
okay.
On Shabbat for the choleh,
yeah.
shechita for him.
Exactly.
But they won't
actually salt it. Well, they won't salt it because it's a sur b'Shabbat. Now again, but that's no. But it all depends, because if it's going to be for the choleh, you could salt that part as well. We're talking about the salting for the healthy person, because for the healthy person, not for the choleh. For the choleh, you could do everything. The choleh, if he needs it salted and he's not going to eat raw meat, you could do anything. You could cook, you could shechita, everything. But here we're talking about that. Now again, there's no problem with the shechita, because en basar muteret ela b'shechita zodomet. No matter what, if you have to slaughter the animal, you have to slaughter the animal. Meaning nowadays, you don't have to slaughter an animal. You have so much meat, don't worry about it. But in the olden days, they didn't have meat. The person's sick. He needs meat right now. So you have to do shechita. Why am I allowed to benefit? Maybe you're going to slaughter also for me, and I'm healthy. No, because you have to do shechita no matter what. So the second you do the shechita, there's no suspicion that you're going to add on. There is a suspicion of cooking. So for example, if I'm going to cook right now for a choleh sheish bo sakana on Shabbat, you or anyone else here cannot eat from there. And the reason why is because we're going to suspect marbeh b'shiurim. Marbeh b'shiurim means I'm going to suspect that maybe you put an extra piece. Why? You know what? Just in case somebody else wants, here it is. You're not allowed to eat it. Not allowed to eat it. Right? That's brought down also in the halakha, the same seif over there. It's also brought down. You're not allowed to. That's marbeh b'shiurim, it's prohibited. But to do with the shechita, anyway, you have to do shechita. There's one shechita that permits the entire animal, whether you want a little tiny piece or a big piece. So you do the shechita. Once the shechita is done, I'm the healthy person. I want to eat it from now. So you're right. You're allowed to eat a raw piece of meat over there. But you rinse it out on the outside, but nothing to do with the you're not allowed to salt. And so that's what we just mentioned here. We just said over here, right? Ravin comes and he says, what happened? Ravin Sava Tafleu bar Gozal Lirav. Ravin Azaken, he came and he took this gozal, this dove, and he put batzek, he put the dough around it. And then he roasts it. Now says the Gemara, so Rav comes and he tells him, if it has a good taste, give it to me to eat. Now 1 second. If right now this batzek was bolea the dam, which means it absorbed the dam, Right now, remember, why did I mention the dam? Because obviously here we're talking about that you roasted it without salting it beforehand. Because if you already salted it, there's no blood afterwards. There's no problem, right? Because if you already salted it, now you could roast it, you could do whatever you want. So here we're talking about that you didn't do any salting, and therefore the blood was still inside. Now you're roasting it. All the blood is coming out, but it's going to be absorbed in the dough. So how could he have the dough?
Because he wrapped it.
He wrapped it around with it, so it's going to absorb the blood.
Through the roasting.
Yes, through the roasting. So now the question is, how are you allowed to have then this how do you call it, this thing? So he comes and he says like this. So he says, Hahi bismidah, which means this batzek that you put it around was of solet, was a fine flour, parir, which is mitporer, which means it breaks up into little tiny pieces. So therefore the blood will come out also of that. Which means it's not that that it was a thick dough all around it, that it didn't seal it, and therefore the blood is going to come inside and going to get absorbed, and that's it. No, what happens is the blood is going to come out also on the sides, because since it's fine flour, so it's going to come out from the crack. So therefore the blood will come out. Don't worry about it. But if it's going to be with regular batzek, regular dough, no. Right? So that's why, by the way, Laurent Becker told me before, this is a cooking class. That's what we're doing now. We're doing cooking. You know, what's halachot? You know, what cooks, what doesn't cook, what this, okay, very good. Yes. If it's fine flour, it's okay. If it's regular flour, no. Okay? So says the Gemara.
Solid.
Yeah.
Fine solid.
Solid, exactly. Solid is fine flour. Okay? So he comes and he says, V'harava ikla leberesh galuta. 1 second, but Rava once went to the Resh Gula, right? Resh Galuta. And what happened was, Utfalule bar avza. And they went and they brought him a baravaz, which is again another type of a duck, the batzek, right? With now what happens is, again, they brought him the dough, the tzaluto, and they came and they roasted it. The Amar, and he said, Ilo de chasite de zi kezuza chivara. If I didn't see that there was there was an appearance of liquid that was coming out of the meat, right? Which is so clear, it was like a dinar chadash, it was like a new dinar, right? Of kesef saruf, of a pure coin. Lo achli mineh, I wouldn't have eaten from it. So basically, what's he coming and saying? He's saying if I wouldn't have seen some simanu kolshehu avad mumit in the lechem, right? That means that there was blood. I wouldn't have actually come and eaten it, right? That means I only ate it because I already saw that whatever was left over was already shakuf ligamri. It didn't look like blood anymore. That means that's why, since it was so clear, that's why I ate it. Because if it did have some type of an appearance of blood, I wouldn't have eaten it. The isa kadana, if you're going to tell me kibolo kach pulto, my idia kizik. So therefore, why is it only if it's going to be that? What if you're going to tell me the concept? Remember, the concept means the way that you absorb it. That's the way that you're going to spit it out. So that's the way with koshering, any type of koshering, whether it's going to be with cooking, whether it's going to be with fire, right? That's why anything which is done without liquid, which is called roasting, so you need a fire to take it out. But it's just like you cooked it with fire, you have to take it out with a fire. Cooking it with a liquid is not taking it out, right? If you cook with a liquid, so then same thing. For example, a microwave. How do you kosher a microwave? So the shita is right with hot water, but with the steam.
With the steam.
Why? Because the steam is what makes the microwave actually cook it, which means the same way that it actually comes and it cooks is through steam. I remember this was actually a very famous question. Can you kosher through steam? This was a question of Dayan Ernchoy that he asked me. He's the Av Bedin of the London Bedin, right? And he asked me this question on my semicha test. Can you kosher through steam or not? I told him it was a machloket at the time. Which one?
What do you want to kosher with?
So let's say you want it now. Why did he say metal? So now, why did he say it was so important to know this halacha? Because libun is burning, right, of a fire. So he says why? Because nowadays the majority of factories they use steam to cook. So he says, so if you could kosher through steam, you have to know this halakha very well nowadays, because it's so practical that nowadays the majority of factories they're using steam.
Because it doesn't burn the food.
It
gives them a little bit more of a leeway.
A leeway. That way they know that they're not going to burn it. So that's why they come and they use steam. So now the question is, how can I kosher through the same steam? Meaning, I want to now kosher the line in between. So can I use steam in between in order to come and to kosher? Right? And this is actually, so this is the same concept, kibolo, kach polto. The way that it's going to absorb is the same way that it's going to let it out as well, which means the way that it gets absorbed inside of it, that's the same way that it's going to let it out. So says the Gemara. Yeah, kibolo kach polto. That's what we always say. Kibolo kach polto.
Was for a permitted way.
Yes, the halacha is that the consensus of the poskim nowadays is that we do it, and that's why nowadays we also kosher microwaves, which means that if you want to kosher a microwave, the Yalkut Yosef says, what do? You take a glass of water, right? And you put soap inside of the water, and then you put it to bubble up. The steam, you put it, turn it on,
so
right?
You'll shake it with the soap
No,
in it?
no. You put the soap in it. You don't shake
I've
it.
done it without the soap in it.
No. Do the soap. You have to
But
do
we
the soap.
wash the whole microwave inside.
Even with, it's better with soap. The reason why you want the soap is because the soap also gives an utintam livgam. It gives a bad taste,
Okay.
right? And that's why it's very important. You
Mhm.
always want to use the soap.
I like
So
it.
you put the soap, right? And then what happens is it starts bubble up. When it bubbles up, and don't open the microwave right away, because remember, it's very, very hot and it bubbles over. You have to watch to make sure that the water bubbles over. When you open it up, you're going to see the entire thing is all, yeah, you understand? But you wait a little bit of time, but it's dangerous, right? Remember, whenever you're koshering, step number one of kashrut is always careful. Be cautious. Don't take off, don't take off your head. You have to be very, very, very cautious. This is the first thing. I was in charge of kashrut in a hotel for Pesach for 2 years. And I was in charge of kashrut in Gibraltar for a few years. So what happened was I remember that I was there, we went, and what happened was we went, and on top of the stoves, you know that they have like the overhangs, they have these the hoods. Thank you. Right, the hoods, the extractors, the hoods on the top. So what happens? You take them down and you have to kasher it. What happened was that we took down one of the extractors in one of these places, and it was filled of gunk, something disgusting, something.
It never was clean.
It was never cleaned. So what happened? Right? We were going to start scraping. And afterwards, we went and we said, you know what? Why don't we just burn it? Yeah, just take the fire and just burn it. Yeah, Mina Shamayim, there was somebody there that he knew a little bit about these things because he was obviously in all these. He goes to me, Rabbi Mina Shamayim, I just caught you guys here beforehand. I said, why? It's oil. What happened is that in that extractor,
will catch fire.
Will catch fire, and that extractor actually goes throughout the entire building until the roof.
Of course.
He says, if you would have put that on fire, the entire
all the way
fire, and it would have started a fire in the entire hotel, from the bottom, from the kitchen until all the way to the roof. The entire thing would have been boom. A really boom. That would have done.
You have no idea how it's that impossible to stop it.
Exactly. That would have been something.
It's impossible to stop that fire.
Oh, so imagine what it is. Imagine. So Mina Shamayim, he caught me on time. Wow. He goes there, so we had to just clean it as best as we could, but it was a problem. In a sense, so now, okay, technically speaking, you're going to tell me that until it gets there, does it get to Yad Soledebo, so on and so forth. But technically speaking, it got so dirty, and it was pig and everything. It was like mamash, you understand? It wasn't just you understand? So okay, but just to understand. So he comes and he says, "My idia kizig." So he says, so what do I have to say now that the food is going to be permitted only if the nozel, only if the liquid is going to be tzalul, is going to be clear? Afilu kilo zignami. So even if it wasn't going to be clear, why? Because the batzek, which is going to be baked, which is this dough that's going to be baked, it's going to spit out all this blood, which was absorbed, which means it's going to absorb the blood, and then it's going to spit it out. So answers the Gemara, hatam bechivarta tesharid. No, there we're talking about kemach lavan, white flour, tesharid, which is very hard. So therefore what happens? It's hard. So therefore what happens is it absorbs, but it doesn't pull it. It's like cheres earthenware. Why is it that you can't kosher earthenware? The reason why is because it absorbs and it doesn't let it out, which means it absorbs and it stays there. So because of that, the same thing, this kemach lavan, this white flour, it absorbs, but it doesn't let it out. So because of that, it's going to absorb the blood, but it's not going to let it out. So we don't say kebolo kapoto in such a scenario. V'hilchata, what is halacha? The smida, if it's fine flour, ben asmik, ben lo asmik, whether it's going to be red or not red, shariat's permitted to eat it. The chivarta, if it's going to be white, izik kezuza chivara, if it's going to be white, like a zuz, right? Like a white zuz, like a white coin, sharia, it's going to be permitted. Vila, and if it's not, it's going to be a seed, it's going to be prohibited. Teshar kemachim, if it's going to be other types of flowers, asmik, if it's going to become red, it's going to be asur. La asmik, if it's not going to become red, it's going to be permitted. Okay, that's the halacha lemaaseh that we just brought down. So these are just the different halachot. Next, hai mulyata. We're now talking about mulyata. Mulyata, even nowadays, right? They call them memulaim in modern Hebrew, but it's coming from the same lashon. Mulyata. What is mulyata? You've got whether it's tzle or off that is going to be roasted, and it's filled with basar katush. It's filled with ground meat, right? It's filled with ground meat, right inside. So manda asar, the one that's going to prohibit this, afilu puma letachat, even if the mouth is going to be towards the floor, towards the fire on the bottom. Uman deshares, so the one that says that it's going to be permitted, right, is afilu puma le'el. Even it's going to be that the mouth is towards the top, which means obviously any type of memulaim has to have an opening. So the opening is going to be whether it's going to be on the top or the bottom, depends where you're going to position it. So remember, by the Korban Pesach, we just said it's going to be downwards, which means that the neck is going to be downwards and all the blood is going to be coming downwards. However, though here, the mulyata, it all depends. But here he says something interesting. He says that the mulyata, according to the one that permits it even if it's upwards. And the one that prohibits is going to prohibit even if the mouth is downwards. Okay, so says the Gemara, Vihilchata, what is halacha? Mulyat shada, the mulyata is going to be permitted. Afilu puma le'el, even if it's going to be upwards, right? That's what he says. So even if it's going to be upwards, it's going to be permitted. So here it says, because we are going to suspect that maybe the blood is going to be absorbed in the basar on the outside, and it's not going to go out through the entrance. Now, even though we just said above by the Korban Pesach that the blood which is coming out, derech betashchita, he says that's because it's going to be rachav, it's going to be much more widened, and therefore there's a lot of place where the blood is going to come out. But in the case of a tler and off, right, it's not so, it's not going to be so open, and therefore the blood does not come out so easily. That's the difference between the Korban Pesach and these animals. Okay. Now to do with umtza. So umtza is again basar chai. So again, raw meat. This is what we just spoke about in the halacha. Yeah, raw meat. So it says when you have a raw meat, right, that what happened is that there's blood inside of it because of a makah, which means the animal received the wound, and when it received the wound, it had internal bleeding. So you have blood inside of it. So it says over here, be'eh, or the beitzei zachar, right, the testicles of the male. Mizrekeh, we're talking about vridim. Vridim are in the neck, you have blood vessels, right? Does he translate it any better there?
No, I'm sorry, I just lost a piece of
Lost it?
testicles, then and the major
arteries.
The arteries. So the major arteries, right? So plige ba Ravacha v'Ravina. So Ravacha and Ravina, they have a machloket on this, right? What does this mean? So it says the Gemara like this: Bechol Torah kula, Ravacha lechumra v'Ravina lekula. Now, usually, whenever you have a machloket between Ravacha and Ravina, these two, usually Ravacha goes lechumra.
Lekuda.
Which one?
Lekuda. No?
Ravacha, he says here lechumra.
Oh, it's lechumra?
Yeah. Usually Ravacha goes lechumra, and Ravina goes lekula. Vehilchata Ravina lekula. Now, usually we paskin like Ravina, which is always lekula. Lebar mehani tlat, right? Except for these three things. What are these three things? It says over here, what are the three things exactly? It says the umtza be'umizreke, right? Which is basically, again, the raw meat, the testicles of the male, and the arteries of the animal in the neck, right? The Ravacha lekula, that here Ravacha goes lekula, and Ravina goes lechumra. The hilchatak Ravacha lekula, and the lacha is like Ravacha lekula, which means usually we always paskin like Ravina lekula, except for here that Ravacha was lekula. We paskin here. Sorry, you were going to the maskana. Yeah, the maskana. Yes, the maskana is in this case
the exception of
the exception of the rule. Exactly.
I made the siman. Acha was over the head, so it's humra.
Very good. Very good. You guys heard that?
This was the exception. That was the
very good. Chazak baruch. Very good. Very good. Chazak baruch. It's a beautiful.
Nice.
Yeah. So acha chumra chet, right? So that's why the chumra and Ravina goes lekula. Except for these three, that it's going to be that Ravacha is going to be lekula. Okay, fine. So says the Gemara, Hai umtza de asmik. This piece of meat that became red because of the makkah, chatche, if you cut it at the beginning, which means you cut it where the blood is, umalche, and then you came and you salted it. So afilu l'kedera shari. So then you're allowed to put it even in a kedera. Why? Because once you cut it and you did the melicha, right? That's it. All the blood came out. So you have a piece of meat. You could tell that there was internal bleeding. So now you cut it, right? You cut it in different places and you start salting it. So now you could put it even in a pot. There's no problem. Shafte b'shibuta, right? The same halacha would apply that if you put it on top of a skewer inside of an oven, shari, it's also going to be permitted. Meidav daiv, if the blood is going to be coming out during the tzliya, during the time of the roasting, right? Because since it's going to be hanged up, so achte agumre, so right? So he comes and he says, if you're going to do it in such a fashion, or you placed it, but if you put it on the gechalim, so then it's going to be a machloket, which means if you placed it on top of the coals, so now it's not hanging. If it's hanging, so now everything's going to come down. If it's not hanging and it's going to be flat on the coals, you've got a problem. So there's going to be a machloket between Ravacha and Ravina. Chad asar v'chad share. Right? One of them is going to be a sur, and one of them is going to say it's going to be permitted. Man de asar, the one that says that it's going to be a sur, matz mitzamit. Why? Because the meat, it shrinks, it comes in, and therefore the blood does not come out, but rather it's going to be absorbed inside of it, and therefore it's a sur to eat it. Man de share, but according to the one that says that it's going to be permitted, mishav shayet. What happens is that it takes out, it draws the blood forth, and therefore it's going to be permitted to eat it because it already drew all the blood, which means the heat of the coals draws the blood out, and since it draws the blood out, it's going to be permitted to eat the meat. Okay, v'hilchata what's halacha? Mishav shayv, that you're allowed to do it. Now, obviously, why? Because we go like Ravina lekula. We already just said that Ravina was always lekula. So even though it only tells us chad asav chad shari, you know who's who, right? V'chen be, the same halacha would apply to the be'eh. No, sorry, this was this was the exception to the rule. This is the umsa, right? So he says v'chem be'eh. Now we're going back to the second case. The second case was the bitzei zachar, the testicles of the male. Chatchinu malchinu, if you cut it and you salted it, afilu l'gdera sharian. So then even to put it in a pot is going to be permitted. Talinhu b'shipuda, if you went and you hung it on a skewer, sharian is going to be permitted. Made of daiv, right? Why? Because the blood is going to come out during the sliyah, during the roasting. But if you placed it on top of the coals, again it's a machlok Ravina, the one that says it's sur, it's because it's going to contract and therefore the blood is not going to come out. The one that permits it is going to say mishashai, that the blood is going to be absorbed from the coals, and therefore again we already said what the halacha was, that it's going to be lekula. The same halacha would apply to the arteries of the neck. If you cut it and you salt it, so even if it's going to be for the kedera, it's going to be permitted. Talia b'shibute, if you hung it up on a skewer, bet hashchita letatayed. Now, if the bet hashchita is downwards, so then what's going to happen is made of dye. So then the blood is going to come out and there's no problem. If you put it flat on top of the gechalim, on top of the coals, the machlok Ravina, one of them says it's permitted, one says it's prohibited. Mandasar, the one that says asur meets what summit is because it contracts and the blood does not come out. Mandashari, and the one that permits it says mishav shayv, it's going to be drawn forth. Behilchata what's halacha? Mishav shayv, which means that it's going to be drawn out. Hai umsa de asmi, when you have this piece of meat which becomes red. Now again, we're talking about raw meat. Chalye asir. So the mohel, which means the liquid that comes out of this meat, is going to be asur. Okay, why? Because since you didn't do any salting, so therefore any type of liquid that comes out is going to be blood. So he says lo asmik, if it does not become red, which means that there's no siman of blood which is there. Chali eshade, so any type of mohel, any type of liquid which comes out of it is going to be permitted. Ravina says, afilu lo asmik, even if it does not become red, nami chali isur, it's also going to become, the mohel is going to become isur. Why? He says because it's impossible that there's not going to have chutim of dam, which means different parts of blood within this liquid that's coming out. It's impossible, so therefore it's going to become prohibited. Yeah. So Amale Mor Baramima Ravashi. He says more Baramima to Ravashi. Abba Megamale Gamue. Abba, he used to actually come, and which is a Meimar, right? Because this is Baram, right? More Baramimar to Ravashi. His father, right, which is a Meimar, he used to come and he used to actually have this moel, he used to eat it, right? That used to come out from the raw meat. So Ikadamri, there are those that say Ravashi Gufem Megamale Gamue. Some people know it was Ravashi himself that used to do this. Okay, so now the Gemara is going to speak about the Basar Tzli as well. Amale more Baramimar Ravashi, he says more Baramimar to Ravashi, Abba, right? My father, Haichala de Khalit Bechadazimna Chometz, right? When you have vinegar, that they went and they put the basar tzli once inside to take out the blood, tu lo tane Khalit be. So now you can't use it anymore a second time in order. Why? Because now it doesn't have any more koach anymore, any more strength to take out the blood, which means if you put it into the vinegar, it has the strength to take out the blood. But once you use it once exactly. Once you use, that's it. It cannot be reused again. Right? It's not a multi-purpose use. It's a right. It's only one time and that's it. So ma'ishna mechala mitamha. So ask the Gemara, what's the difference between right this chometz that they already did it once and chometz which is very very weak techaltina be, right? Which we do use it. Which means why are you telling me that the second that you used a good vinegar, that once it was used once, it lost its powers of retrieving the blood and then that's it? He says, what about a very weak vinegar? We didn't say that you're not allowed to use it because it's too weak. And there we said that you're allowed to use any type of vinegar to take out the blood. So answers the Gemara, Hatam ite, we are on Ayin Hamud Aleph 75a on the top. Hatam iya lekiua de pera bene, which means we have the chamitzuta tivit of the pri, which is actually there, which means you actually see the natural bitterness, right? And therefore it does not become weakened when you take out the blood. But here, when you have chometz, you actually did use it once already. Leta likiua de pera bene. You don't have the same chometz, you don't have the same bitterness anymore, and therefore you see that it does not have the same powers anymore, right? In order to take out the.
Explain that last part.
Basically what happens is the last part we're talking about.
The weak vinegar.
The weak vinegar, you could still see that it still has a bitterness. So the fact that it still has a bitterness, so therefore, since it still has bitterness, it has the power to take out blood. But when you have the vinegar that was already once used, you don't see anymore that it has a bitterness. Since it doesn't have bitterness anymore, that's why it doesn't have the power anymore to take out the blood. So we stopped at the 2 dots on Ayin Hamud Aleph. I apologize, B'ezrat Hashem. We continue tomorrow.